At 3:12 in the morning, my prepaid phone vibrated once on the chipped nightstand beside the sagging motel bed. The screen, webbed with tiny fractures from when I dropped it during a panic attack 2 weeks ago, lit up with a single notification. One message, 3 words. Enjoy being broke. That was it. From Lauren Caldwell, my ex-wife, the woman who used to kiss me good morning before I left for work. The same woman who once cried in my arms the day her father died, and now she was sending me taunts from what I could only assume was the marble bathroom of some ocean view penthouse. Probably with a flute of vintage champagne in one hand, and that smug smirk on her face as she watched her new life unfold. One that had no place for a man like me anymore. The motel room reeked of bleach and something older, something sour and defeated, like a mixture of old cigarettes, mold, and resignation. The mattress beneath me groaned as I sat there frozen, phone still in my hand, staring at that glowing text. I didn't even have the energy to be angry, just hollow. A sort of heavy silence settled in my chest, like gravity had doubled. I looked around at my surroundings, the peeling wallpaper, the noisy air conditioner that gave out more rattles than cold air, and the cold styrofoam cup of instant noodles that had long since stopped steaming beside me. This was my life now. My world shrunk down to this cheap room, the clothes I could fit in a duffel bag, and a phone that barely held a charge anymore. 6 months ago, I had a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. People used to ask for my advice, for my signature, even just my attention. I was respected. I was comfortable. I had routines. Weekends with Lauren were filled with brunches, bookstore trips, and slow mornings in bed where we'd talk about the future like it was ours to sculpt. But all it took was one misstep, one bad investment, one project that tanked because I trusted the wrong guy. My reputation collapsed like a house of cards in a storm. Within weeks, clients vanished. The firm cut ties. Friends I used to grab drinks would stop replying. The pity looks were worse than silence. Lauren tried to play the part of the supportive wife at first, but I could see it in her eyes. The patience was a mask, and the cracks started showing fast. She left on a Thursday. I remember because I'd spent the whole morning trying to get through to my old contacts, hoping someone could offer me a second chance. I came home and found closets empty, her ring left on the kitchen counter beside a note that simply read, "I need something more than this." That was all. Not a conversation, not a breakdown of what went wrong, just a quiet, clinical goodbye, like closing a browser tab. I didn't even know about the Billionaire until a month later, when mutual friends started gossiping. Apparently, she met him at some charity auction, while I was busy pawning my watch to keep the electricity on. So here I was months later, working graveyard shifts at a 24-hour gas station on the outskirts of town, wearing a name tag that said Trevor, even though my name's Kyle, because the manager never bothered to order a new one. I'd lie and tell customers it was my middle name just to avoid the explanation. I lived on vending machine coffee and dollar store ramen, slept 4 hours a day if I was lucky, and kept a printed resume folded in my back pocket. Even though I hadn't updated in weeks, I kept thinking maybe someone would walk in, recognize me, ask what I was doing there, and offer me a lifeline that never happened. I didn't know why Lauren sent the text. Maybe it was a drunken impulse. Maybe she wanted to twist the knife one more time. Or maybe it wasn't about me at all. Maybe it was just her way of reminding herself how far above me she now stood, that she'd made the right choice, that she'd traded up. It worked, because as I sat there in that tiny room, under the buzzing yellow light, I felt so far removed from who I used to be, it was like looking back on someone else's life. I tried to imagine what Lauren was doing in that moment, maybe curled up on some velvet couch beside a fireplace, surrounded by silent wealth, or laughing at some joke her new man told, her legs tucked beneath her, as if 12 years with me had been a phase she'd grown out of. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there with the phone in my lap, screen now gone dark, and listened to the hum of the vending machine outside the door. The only thing I could feel anymore was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but a bone-deep exhaustion that settled into your soul. I looked over at the half-empty duffel bag by the door. Everything I own in the world could fit in it now. I thought about deleting the message. I thought about replying. I thought about throwing the phone at the wall. Instead, I powered it off and set it down beside me. Then I lay back on the stained sheets, stared up at the ceiling with its cracked plaster, and waited for the sun to rise, unsure if I'd even notice when it did. For nearly 2 decades, I built my life brick by brick, methodical and precise, just like the structures I helped design. At 41, I was a senior structural systems engineer for a major manufacturing firm in Oregon, earning a solid 6-figure salary, respected by peers and trusted by leadership. I contributed to innovations that earned us industry awards, had 3 patents with my name on them, and was in line for a director-level position by the end of the fiscal year. My name actually meant something in the circles I worked in. My schedule was demanding, sure, late nights buried in specs, early mornings reviewing site load tests, but I loved the work, and I thought I was doing for both of us, for our future. Lauren had quit her admin job 6 years into our marriage. She said she was burned out, sick of typing memos and answering phones. I supported her without hesitation. She told me she wanted to explore more creative work, branding, digital consulting, photography. I want to build something for myself, she said, holding my hands like she meant it. I believed her. I even encouraged her. When she wanted to redesign the home office into a content studio, I tore out the carpet and put in hardwood, installed new lighting, repainted the walls with her chosen matte cream color. I paid for new cameras, editing software, and ergonomic chairs that cost more than my first car. Every dollar, every favor I called in, I chalked it up to supporting the woman I loved. In the beginning, I didn't notice the changes. It started small. A new handbag here, a weekend girls' retreat there, then came the designer clothes, tags I didn't even recognize, fabrics that needed to be dry cleaned after one wear. I come home from a 12-hour shift covering graphite dust, only to find her in silk robes browsing private invitation-only boutiques online. She said it was for her image, that in the world of digital branding, appearance was everything. I nodded along and told myself she knew what she was doing. She said she needed to attend networking events and exclusive industry galas that I never got invited to. She'd leave wearing jewelry I didn't recognize and come home late, sometimes not until dawn. But I never accused her. I never pushed. I told myself I trusted her, because that's what a good husband does. Looking back now, the signs were screaming at me. She stopped asking how my day was, stopped texting me when she was out. She was always smiling, always glowing that carefully filtered way that seemed too perfect to be real. And it wasn't. She had an entirely separate life unfolding in front of me, and I was too blind, or maybe too hopeful, to see it for what it was. She built a brand, all right, but not the one she claimed. She built herself into the kind of woman billionaires noticed. Apparently one did. She met him at some high society charity gala. I paid for her to attend. $2,000 plate, tuxedo rental, salon appointment, the whole 9 yards. I stayed home with migraine from back-to-back site evaluations and ordered takeout. She came back that night with a look I couldn't name at the time, but I now recognize as detachment, like a cord had been quietly severed, and she wasn't tethered to me anymore. After that, she was always texting someone with a little too much secrecy. She started laughing at things I wasn't part of. I became background noise. The engineer husband who had potential, who had stability, but who apparently wasn't enough. It didn't happen all at once, the unraveling. It was death by 1,000 cuts. I went from being her partner to her placeholder. My opinion stopped mattering. My achievements became boring anecdotes. When I told her I'd been asked to lead the firm's West Coast Innovation Initiative, she blinked at me, barely looked up from her phone, and muttered, "That's great, babe," like I just told her I bought eggs. The woman who once made me chocolate cake after a minor raise now couldn't be bothered to ask what city I was flying to the next morning. And still, I clung to hope. I thought maybe it was stress. Maybe we needed a trip, some space to reconnect. I booked a weekend in Mendocino, ocean view, secluded spa. She canceled the day before, said something about a client emergency. That weekend, she tagged herself at a vineyard hours away, smiling next to a man I didn't know. I confronted her once. Just once. I asked if she was seeing someone. She didn't deny it. She didn't confirm it either. She just tilted her head and said, "Does it matter?" That sentence gutted me more than any confession could have. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't conflicted. She was just done. Like I was a chapter she had already closed, and I was the idiot still reading it out loud. From there, the divorce moved fast. She wanted everything. The house, the savings, the car we technically co-owned. Her lawyer, paid for with my money, was ruthless. She knew exactly what buttons to push, what weaknesses to exploit. And she did. The court didn't care that I paid for everything for over a decade. They saw a woman who had given up her career to support her husband and now needed financial stability. I ended up with less than 25% of our shared assets. The rest was hers, down to the espresso machine I bought for her birthday. When it was all over, I stood outside the courthouse in the rain, holding a cardboard box of leftover papers and a jacket I kept in my car. She walked out 10 minutes later laughing into her phone, stepping into a black car with tinted windows and leather seats. I don't know if it was him. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she didn't look back in less than a year. I went from respected to erased. Not just from her life, but from the one I thought we were building. The career I loved eventually slipped too. With the divorce stress, I lost focus, missed a few deadlines, got passed over for the promotion. I was asked to take a sabbatical to clear my head. Translation: go away quietly. And I did. I rented a cheap place an hour outside Portland, started working odd gigs under the table, and tried to piece together some version of who I used to be. But every time I got close to feeling normal, something like that text would show up. Just a reminder that I'd been replaced, discarded, and mocked by the only person I thought would never do that to me. I didn't learn about the affair through intuition or a sudden burst of courage. I learned because patterns don't lie, and I've spent my entire adult life trained to notice when something doesn't add up. Expense reports, timestamps, inconsistencies. Those things talk if you listen long enough. Lauren's lies started leaving footprints she didn't bother to sweep away anymore. Hotel charges in cities she claimed she'd never visited. Reservations under her name booked during weekends. She said she was at silent retreats. And a burner email account she forgot to log out of on the home tablet. I wasn't snooping at first. I was troubleshooting a sinking issue. That's the part that still makes me feel stupid. I trusted her so completely that I wasn't even looking for betrayal when it was already entrenched in my life. The name that kept appearing was Richard Halston. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Oregon is full of wealthy donors and investors, and Richard was a familiar name in my professional orbit. He came from generational money, the kind that doesn't advertise itself because it doesn't need to. He sat on my company's advisory council, the sort of man executives lowered their voices around. Old money posture, understated suits, polite smiles that never reached the eyes. I'd shaken his hand at corporate dinners. I'd listened to him talk about long-term vision and legacy impact while sipping overpriced bourbon. I never once imagined he'd be sleeping with my wife. When I finally confronted Lauren, I expected tears, excuses, maybe even denial. I laid everything out on the kitchen table like evidence in a case file. Printed hotel receipts, screenshots, dates highlighted in yellow. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I asked her how long it had been going on. She didn't even glance at the papers. She leaned back against the counter, crossed her arms, and smiled. Not nervously, not defensively. It was a calm, satisfied smile, like someone had already won and was waiting for the other person to catch up. She told me Richard understood her, that he saw her potential, that he could give her the life she deserved, a word she emphasized like it was a verdict. She said love wasn't enough anymore, not when power and access were on the table. She didn't apologize. She didn't flinch. She talked about private flights, European summers, foundations with her name on them, and connections that made my entire career look small. I remember thinking, in that moment, that I wasn't her husband anymore. I was an obstacle she'd already stepped over. A month later, the divorce papers arrived, delivered by courier like a hostile acquisition. There was nothing amicable about them. Every clause was aggressive. Every demand calculated to leave me with as little leverage as possible. It was obvious money was backing the attack, the kind of money that hires lawyers who don't negotiate, they dictate. Richard never appeared directly, never signed anything, never needed to. His influence was everywhere, silent and suffocated. My attorney tried to push back, but it was like fighting a machine designed to grind people down through attrition. Motions piled up, fees skyrocketed. Lauren's requests grew bolder with each filing. During mediation, she sat across from me calm and polished, wearing a watch that cost more than my monthly rent would soon be. She spoke about our marriage like it was a failed startup, unfortunate but necessary to dissolve. I watched the woman I once loved recite talking points written by people who saw me as a liability to be neutralized. Every time I opened my mouth, her legal team shut me down. Every time I thought I had a fair argument, another document appeared to counter it. Richard's shadow loomed over the entire process, unspoken but unmistakable. This was what power looked like when it didn't need to announce itself. When the divorce was finalized, I walked out with a bare minimum and a crushing understanding of how easily a life can be dismantled when someone with more resources decides you're expendable. Lauren didn't look back. She never does. She moved seamlessly into her new world, escorted by a man who had the means to erase problems rather than solve them. And I was left standing in the wreckage, not just betrayed by my wife, but by the realization that integrity and hard work mean very little when stacked against wealth that doesn't play by the same rules. 2 weeks after the divorce papers landed in my lap, before I could even process the full damage of what Lauren and her billionaire benefactor had orchestrated, I was called into human resources. The email was sterile, the kind they send when they've already decided your future. Please report to HR at 10 a.m. for a meeting regarding departmental restructuring. I knew the language well enough to read between the lines, but I still held on to the faint hope that maybe they just wanted to reassign me. Maybe they'd seen the headlines about my divorce and felt sympathy. Maybe they still remembered that I devoted nearly a decade of my life to this company, overhauling outdated systems, implementing safer load tolerance protocols, earning awards for efficiency and safety, mentoring younger engineers who barely knew how to calculate shear force when they joined. The HR office was quiet that morning. Too quiet. No coffee brewing, no light chatter. Just a middle manager with dead eyes and a printout. I sat down, tried to steady my breathing, and waited for them to tell me how they were going to dismantle everything I'd worked for. And they did. Due to departmental restructuring and shifting organizational priorities, they said, "Your position has been eliminated effective immediately." They didn't even let me finish the coffee I brought. 9 years, dozens of projects, long nights, weekend sacrifice, and was gone in 10 minutes. I asked for a reason. I asked what had changed. They handed me a severance agreement and said I could review it with legal counsel. That was their answer. What I didn't know at the time was that this wasn't just corporate downsizing. It was an execution. Silent, targeted, and devastating. My desk was packed up without me. I wasn't even allowed back on the floor. I walked out of that building carrying a sealed manila envelope and nothing else. Not even a thank you. At first, I told myself I could bounce back. My resume was solid. My references were strong. I led major infrastructure projects that were still being used as case studies in engineering journals. I reached out to contacts, sent out applications, lined up interviews. That's when the rejections started piling up. Not the polite, slow fade-outs you get when you're not a perfect fit. These were abrupt, cold, sometimes within hours. Some didn't even respond after calling me promising. It didn't make sense. Then came the recruiter. He was an old colleague who had moved into talent acquisition at a rival firm. He and I had worked on a suspension bridge redesign years ago and kept in touch loosely. When I followed up on an interview I'd never heard back from, he finally gave me the truth. He said, "Kyle, off the record, your name's radioactive right now. There's talk you falsified safety reports, that your calculations on the Wayne Field plant project were deliberately manipulated to pass inspection." I almost dropped the phone. It was a project I'd taken lead on, one I'd spent months poring over to ensure every margin of error was bulletproof. The reports were perfect, audited twice. My work had been flawless. I asked where the hell that rumor came from. He hesitated, then said, "Someone from the Halston Circle." Just like that, the picture became clear. Richard, the same man who stole my wife, had reached into my profession and snapped the spine of my career with one whisper, one email, one phone call. Maybe not even from him directly, just someone with his last name or sitting in his circles. That was all it took. There wasn't even an investigation, just doubt seated in the right ears. In this industry, reputation is everything. Trust is currency. And once someone questions your integrity, your entire portfolio becomes suspect. I wasn't just unemployed. I was unemployable. Desperation crept in fast. I started dipping into savings to survive, paying legal fees for the divorce, tried to keep up appearances while applying for jobs I used to be overqualified for. Project coordinator roles, assistant engineer gigs, even temp construction audits. Nothing. Doors that used to swing open with a single email now stayed locked. Lauren's legal team, backed by Richard's seemingly limitless resources, kept filing motions, prolonging court dates, demanding document after document. Then, just as my account balance was starting to run thin, I got hit with a temporary financial injunction. Lauren's lawyers filed a motion claiming I was hiding assets, that I'd funneled money out of our joint holdings into private accounts in anticipation of the divorce. A lie. A fabricated narrative designed to freeze everything. And it worked. My accounts were locked. Credit lines suspended. I couldn't even access the emergency fund I'd kept for years. I went to the bank and watched the teller's face shift from polite to uncomfortable as she explained that all transactions had been halted pending court review. I had $73 in cash and no way to move anything. I tried to fight it. My lawyer filed appeals, submitted statements, pulled records proving every deposit and withdrawal. But it didn't matter. The delay was a punishment. Every week that passed drained me further. I sold my car, cashed out a retirement account with massive penalties, took gig jobs under the table, manual labor, overnight inventory shifts at warehouse stores, anything that paid fast and in cash. My body ached constantly. My pride eroded piece by piece. And the worst part was knowing it wasn't random. It was methodical. Richard Halston didn't just take my wife. He dismantled my credibility, froze my finances, and left me stranded in a world I no longer recognized. Not with fire, with silence. Quiet power is the deadliest kind. It doesn't shout. It deletes. Rock bottom didn't arrive all at once. It came in stages, each one stripping something away until there was nothing left to negotiate with. First went the house. Not because I missed payments at the start, but because once my accounts were frozen and my income evaporated, the math stopped working. I remember walking through the empty rooms after the notice came, touching the walls I'd painted myself, the doorway where Lauren used to lean and watch me cook on Sunday mornings, the office where I once reviewed blueprints that determined whether buildings stood or collapsed. I locked the door for the last time and left the keys on the counter because there was no one left to hand them to. The silence inside the house was louder than any argument we'd ever had. Without access to my money, everything became a calculation. Food or gas, gas or rent or legal fees. I slept on a friend's couch for a while, then in my car, then finally scraped together enough for a rundown motel that charged by the week and didn't ask questions. My days were spent chasing dead-end leads and filing paperwork that went nowhere. My nights were spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision that led me there, wondering which one had doomed me. Pride doesn't die easily, but hunger and exhaustion will finish it off if you give them enough time. The job at the hospital came through because they were desperate, and I didn't ask questions. Overnight sanitation, third shift, no interview worth mentioning, just a background check, and a clipboard slid across a desk. The uniform was thin blue scrubs, a badge with my photo on it, and gloves that never quite fit right. My responsibilities were simple and brutal. Clean blood off floors, empty biohazard bins, sanitize exam rooms after emergencies, scrub operating theaters at 3 a.m. while surgeons slept and administrators dreamed up new mission statements. I pushed a cart down hallways I once consulted on indirectly. Systems I'd helped design in theory, now reduced to wiping bodily fluids off stainless steel surfaces beneath flickering fluorescent lights. No one there knew who I was or what I used to do, and after a while, I stopped remembering it myself. I learned the rhythm of the night shift, the way time stretched and folded in on itself. The smell of disinfectant soaked into my skin no matter how long I showered. My hands cracked and bled from constant washing. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the polished glass of the patient room door and barely recognize a man staring back. Shoulders slumped, eyes dull, face older than it had any right to be. That night, after a 12-hour shift that involved cleaning an ER bay after a multi-car accident, I got back to the motel just before dawn. My body ached in places I didn't know could ache. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in uniform, boots on, too tired to move. That's when my phone buzzed. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I opened a message anyway and enjoy being broke. 3 words. Cold, precise, a victory lap disguised as cruelty. I didn't have to scroll to know what she'd been doing. Earlier, during my break, I'd made a mistake of opening social media. Lauren was there in a black gown that probably cost more than I made in a year now, standing beside Richard under chandeliers and camera flashes. A black tie gala. Smiles. Crystal glasses raised in celebration. The caption talked about philanthropy and impact, words that felt obscene coming from someone who had systematically dismantled my life. The text came minutes after the photos went up, like she wanted to make sure I connected the dots. I sat there in that motel room, still smelling like antiseptic and sweat, holding a phone with a cracked screen and no future on the calendar. And I believed her. Completely. I believed I was finished. That this was the end state of my life, not a phase or a detour, but a permanent downgrade. From engineer to janitor. From husband to punchline. From respected to invisible. I powered the phone off and lay back on the bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, fully convinced that whatever I used to be was gone forever, and that the uniform I wore to clean other people's messes was all I would ever be from that point on. It happened just after 3 a.m, near the end of my shift when fatigue made everything slower, heavier, harder to track. I was hauling a bin of surgical waste down a corridor lined with glass-walled procedure rooms when my cart clipped a corner I'd passed 100 times before without incident. The motion sent a sealed tray of used instruments tumbling. A seal container shattered on impact, some faulty clasp or a rush seal, and a scalpel and a broken piece of lab glass slid free, both coated with dried blood and chemical residue. I went to gather the pieces like I'd done dozens of times with broken equipment, but I wasn't wearing the reinforced gloves yet. One sharp edge sliced clean across my left palm before I even registered the sting. It was deep, right across the muscle, and instantly blood began to pour out onto the tile. I wrapped it in gauze from my cart, compressing it with a trembling hand. My supervisor insisted I go straight to the ER, not because of the cut itself, but because of exposure protocol. It was routine, he said. Check for contamination, run the standard blood panel, clear me for return. I didn't argue. I sat in that cold ER bay, palm throbbing, watching the fluorescent lights pulse above me, while a nurse drew 3 full vials of blood and labeled them with shaking hands. I thought it was from being tired. She didn't say much, just told me to sit tight while they processed everything. 30 minutes passed, then 45, then over an hour. My cut was clean, numbed, and stitched by a resident who looked barely old enough to drive. He smiled, made a joke about me getting hazard pay, and left me alone again. That's when the atmosphere changed. A new group entered the room. 3 doctors, a hospital administrator, and someone I didn't recognize wearing a suit without a badge. No one smiled. No one looked at my hand. They stood close to each other, whispering first. Then one of them stepped forward and asked calmly, but firmly, about my family medical history. I told them what I always had. I was adopted. The paperwork from the agency had limited information, and I'd never pursued it. My adoptive parents were middle class, loving, but they'd never known anything about where I came from. The lead physician nodded slowly, like that answered more than I realized. She asked if I'd ever submitted DNA to a health service or ancestry platform. I said I had once, years ago, during a health scare, one of those direct-to-consumer genetic testing kits I'd ordered online when I was paranoid about heart issues in my 30s. She asked if I remember which company I did. She didn't blink, just turned to the man in the suit and whispered something. Everything after that slowed down, like my life had shifted into another gear, one where I couldn't catch up. They said there had been a flag in the system, something about a rare genetic marker tied to a registry that wasn't public, a private medical database used by a limited circle of institutions, not the kind you find in generic databases, but one maintained for a very specific reason, tracking hereditary conditions within closed bloodlines. One of the doctors said the system had automatically cross-referenced my DNA during contamination screening. It triggered an alert, not for disease, for identity. They didn't say it outright, not at first, but it was clear from the weight in their voices, from the careful glances they exchanged, from the tension hanging between every word they chose not to say. I asked again what was going on. The man in the suit finally stepped forward and handed me a tablet. On it was a redacted profile, the name blacked out, but the genetic match highlighted in green. My profile, a 99.98% match to a lineage tied to one of the oldest industrial dynasties in the United States. Companies older than the IRS, with roots that stretch back before the Great Depression, with board seats handed down like heirlooms, with private medical infrastructures so advanced they operated separate from anything public. The last line on the screen read, "Direct familial relation confirmed." I sat there in my scrubs, smelling like bleach and blood, staring at the screen while my stitched palm pulsed in my lap. I asked them what the hell it meant. One doctor cleared her throat and said, carefully, that someone from that lineage, someone very high up, must have donated a sample at some point to this private system, most likely for succession tracking, genetic predisposition studies, or insurance underwriting. These families didn't use standard health care. They didn't rely on blood banks or commercial testing. They used internal infrastructure, private clinics, private networks, sealed labs. Mine had triggered something inside that vault. I told them there was no way. I was the adopted son of a middle-class schoolteacher and an accountant who lived in the suburbs. I worked graveyard sanitation. I hadn't been born into anything except obscurity. But they just stood there, calm, as if this kind of thing had happened before, as if people like me stumbled into secrets like this more often than the world would care to admit. I wasn't who I thought I was. I wasn't just a man who lost everything to a bitter divorce and a smear campaign. I was someone, or at least from someone, important enough for the medical system to stop in its tracks when my blood entered it. Less than a full day after the ER incident, I was escorted, still bandaged, still exhausted, into the top floor of a high-rise law firm that occupied an entire block of downtown Portland. I wore the only clean clothes I had, a button-up from my temp agency orientation, and I kept my eyes low as I passed marble statues, mahogany walls, and assistants who moved like they'd been trained by intelligence agencies. No one told me what to expect. They just said, "You've been requested for a meeting regarding sensitive personal matters," and handed me a pre-signed non-disclosure agreement before I was even in the building. It felt less like an invitation and more like a summons from something ancient. She was waiting for me in a private conference room with views of the entire skyline. Margaret Vale. White hair swept back into a severe knot, navy suit, no makeup, and eyes sharp enough to cut to the table between us. She didn't offer a handshake. She didn't smile. She simply gestured to the chair across from her and waited until I sat before speaking. Her voice was clear and formal, like a woman who'd spent a lifetime issuing commands that carried legal weight. She introduced herself as the head of the Vale Industrial Trust, a family conglomerate with assets in energy, manufacturing, and infrastructure dating back to the early 20th century. Then, in one sentence, she changed the entire trajectory of my life. "My brother, your biological father, died in 1996. We lost track of you shortly after your birth, when you were placed for adoption under sealed arrangements." I didn't speak. I didn't breathe. I just stared at her, trying to register what she was saying. She continued, without emotion, explaining that DNA confirmation had triggered a clause in the Vale family estate structure. There were no other legitimate heirs. All others in the bloodline were either deceased, estranged, or disqualified due to prior litigation. That left me, legally, biologically, irrevocably, as the sole surviving heir of one of the oldest industrial families in the United States. There was no ceremony, no reading of wills or a champagne toast. Just facts, forms, and a team of lawyers who began assembling binders as soon as my identity was verified. I was entitled to full control of 2 primary trusts, each valued at mid-9 figures, along with voting shares in several multinational companies, land holdings, and various historical assets that weren't even fully explained to me that day. Immediate liquidity, they said, would be transferred to a secure account within 72 hours. 7 figures, ready to access. The rest, managed through layers of private banking structures that had existed longer than I'd been alive. Margaret explained this like she was reading a balance sheet. There was no warmth, no family reunion. She wasn't offering love or connection. She was delivering obligation. "Your position within the trust," she said, "is not ceremonial. You'll be expected to learn quickly. Legacy is not something we leave unattended." Then she stood, nodded once, and left the room. The lawyers remained. They walked me through the logistics, where to sign, what to review, who will be assigned to assist me. Private advisors, security, estate managers, tax attorneys. They didn't ask what I wanted. They told me what needed to be done. But when the meeting finally ended and the doors closed behind them, I sat alone in that conference room and let the truth hit me in full. I was no longer broke, no longer erased, no longer at the mercy of men like Richard Halston. I didn't buy a car. I didn't walk into a dealership with cash or throw a party on a yacht. I didn't rent a penthouse or book a round-the-world flight. The first wire I authorized was to retain one of the most brutal, relentless, and respected litigation firms on the West Coast, specialists in asset recovery, corporate warfare, and personal reputation restoration. I handed them a stack of records, names, emails, and receipts. I told them to find everything Richard had touched. I told them to dig up every smear campaign, every falsified whisper that had kept me out of work. I told them I wanted every email subpoenaed, every handshake investigated, every legal angle explored until the man who tried to ruin me remembered what it felt like to be hunted. I didn't want revenge. I wanted rectification. I wanted justice. And now, for the first time in years, I had the resources to make it happen. When I stepped into the office of Randall Krieger, there was no warm greeting, no handshake, just a sharp nod and a folder already waiting for me on the desk. He didn't waste time asking me if I was ready for what came next. He only asked how far I wanted to take it. I told him the truth, all the way. Randall was known in legal circles as the kind of man who didn't settle, who didn't blink, and who didn't stop until the other side was financially and reputationally unrecognizable. He didn't talk about ethics or revenge. He talked about leverage, asset tracing, subpoenas, and case law. Within a week, he and his team had drafted the framework for what would become a multi-pronged legal assault: defamation, interference with livelihood, malicious misrepresentation, breach of contract, and more. We filed suit against my former employer, the company's board of directors, and Richard Halston personally. The documents were thick with evidence, and every page carried weight. It was surgical. Randall's team pulled archive server data, recovered deleted emails, and obtained call recordings from anonymous whistleblowers who'd worked under Halston's direction. One by one, the lies that had wrecked my career began to unravel in front of a federal judge. There were emails between executives discussing the quiet termination of my contract to appease certain high-level stakeholders. There was a recorded call, captured and backed up on a third-party line, where Halston directly suggested neutralizing my influence in the industry through professional rumors. One board member folded under deposition and admitted they had received strategic guidance from Halston regarding my removal. None of them expected I would ever have the money or the power to fight back, but I did, and I came armed. In court, every defense their lawyers tried to mount was torn down with precision. Their objections rang hollow. Their stories didn't line up. Their timelines contradicted the evidence. The judge saw through the spin fast. What began as a professional dispute was exposed for what it really was, a targeted attempt to destroy a man's reputation and future out of ego, greed, and calculated cruelty. Lauren was subpoenaed as a witness, and the day she walked into court, I barely recognized her. Gone was the polished mask she wore at charity events. She was visibly shaken, clutching a handbag like it might protect her from the truth. She tried to maintain composure, but under cross-examination, the timeline of her actions collapsed. Her involvement in the asset-freezing motion, based on fabricated claims of financial deceit, became impossible to defend. When confronted with evidence of her coordinated communication with Richard's team, emails outlining how to pressure me legally, she froze. Her voice cracked. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of her lawyer's pen scratching desperate notes. When the ruling came down, it was swift and unflinching. The court awarded me full damages for professional and personal harm done, millions. My name was publicly cleared, my work formally reinstated into industry archives, and every slanderous report formally retracted. The judge vacated every one of Lauren's financial claims and labeled her actions as knowingly deceitful with intent to defraud. She was stripped of all entitlement, left without spousal support, and responsible for covering her own legal fees. But the most satisfying blow came when the consequences turned toward Richard. Once the ruling became public, pressure mounted within the boards he sat on. Internal investigations were launched. Statements were issued. Within weeks, he was forced to resign from 3 major corporations. Stockholders demanded accountability. His name was removed from foundation listings and gala invites. In a world where reputation is power, his vanished in real time. Outside the courthouse, after the verdict was read and the reporters began crowding the stairs, I saw Lauren again. She was standing off to the side, eyes red, cheeks streaked with tears, hair disheveled like she'd run out of fight somewhere in the hallway. She walked up to me slowly, quietly, like the moment might collapse if she moved too fast. Her voice was soft, trembling. She said she was sorry. She said she had been scared. That thing spiraled too far. That she didn't know what else to do. She asked if I remembered how we used to laugh in bed on Sundays, how I used to make pancakes with too much cinnamon because she liked it that way I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then I looked her straight in the eyes and said, calmly, "You wanted me poor. Now you get to live it." She didn't reply. Her face crumpled, and she began to cry again, but I had nothing left to offer her. Not hate, not sympathy, just silence. I turned and walked down the courthouse steps into the sunlight, past the cameras, past the questions, past the past. I don't hate her. I don't even feel angry anymore. I just don't think about her. She's part of a life that doesn't exist anymore. A chapter closed, not out of revenge, but out of necessity. Some things you bury not to forget, but to stop them from poisoning what comes next.